Hello, this is Unsung with GameLeap, and in today's video we're going to be covering the patch 13.23 preview as well as some leaked changes that Riot themselves have not announced. As always, the numbers here are going to be subject to change. Some changes might not ship in their entirety, or they might be extended on the PvE for another cycle. That being said, there are some really cool buffs and nerfs here, so let's go ahead and get right into this preview. First and foremost, Riot has officially acknowledged that Orianna and Syndra are overpowered in the higher tiers of play, but they're relatively balanced for average tiers. For these reasons, Riot doesn't actually want to nerf these champions until the item changes come out. They're scared of putting them back in Pro Gel, so they're just going to let them dominate solo queue for a little bit. Now, I don't personally agree with this. I think that Orianna and Syndra should get nerfed, just that way they're not crowding out the other mid lane champions. The control mages being strong really does suffocate the meta as a whole, and there is a gigantic reduction in the amount of viable champions that you can blind pick whenever this style of control mage is viable. Riot should tap these champions down just a tad in my opinion, but let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Personally, I've seen a lot of Syndra and Orianna in the last 2 weeks, and I'm pretty sick of it, and I'm sick of my mid laners not being able to play the game into them, so a nerf is more than welcome. Now that we covered Orianna and Syndra, let's go ahead and talk about split pushing and the important changes that are coming our way. In the current meta, stacking Drakes is the best way to win, and snowballing has been reduced by a great margin. Death timers got cut shorter in the early game, the amount of gold that you get from plates is really low, and quite frankly, stomping your lane isn't as rewarding as it was before. In order to combat the Drake stacking meta, Riot is making both the tier 2 and tier 3 turret worth significantly more gold. This will give you another avenue to actually win the game aside from just stacking Drakes, but of course this is still going to be the superior option. This unfortunately is a buff to the Hullbreaker PvE interactions that are going on in top lane, so that means that you'll see more Yone and Fiora. Putting some snowballing back in your lane is a great idea, but incentivizing the PvE gameplay is not really that smart in my opinion, especially with how toxic the Hullbreaker champions have been lately. I'm sure that if you guys are playing in your Emerald and Platinum games, there are people that straight up refuse to play with their team. They only sit in the side lane and they have no concept of macro aside from hitting a turret. This is only going to exacerbate that issue and make it a little bit worse. Personally, I think that Riot can include snowballing back in a different area. Shoehorning a lot of gold into turrets is just going to make people sacrifice themselves for them a lot more often, which is already kind of problematic if there's a Hullbreaker champ in your game. Just a quick reminder, if any of these champions catch your eye, head on over to GameLeap.com, where I've spent hundreds of hours crafting courses to get you onto the Rift as soon as possible. That is it for system changes here. Let's get into champion buffs and nerfs now. Our first champion up for buffs is an interesting one. It is actually Draven. This is one of the most banned AD carries in the game, with his low elo ban rate being a little bit lower than his high elo ban rate, which then skyrockets up to 30%. So it's pretty interesting that Riot is considering buffing him at all, but to be fair, the buff that they're giving him is quite small. Now after death, Draven's Whirling Death will return to him. This will be nice if you throw your ultimate as a last ditch, so that way you can cash in on some stacks after you lose them from dying. Of all the buffs that they could have given Draven, this is probably one of the most tame ones, but I'm not sure that this champion needs a buff instead of a nerf. Next up on our buff list is going to be Janna. Janna got a full revert back to what she was previously, but the numbers that the revert shipped with were a little bit on the lower end to prevent her from shipping in an overpowered state. This version of Janna was already quite strong for a long time. That's why we have her in S tier in the last tier list. It is inevitable that this champion will come to the forefront of the meta again, simply due to how oppressive she is in the lane phase. Janna has basically the best of all worlds. She's able to peel herself, she deals great damage, and she has shield for damage mitigation in trades as well. The buffs here are targeted mostly towards Janna's lane, especially in the early game. Her passive damage from move speed is no longer scaling by a total percentage. Currently it goes from 20, 25, 30, 35, it's going to a flat 30%, so Janna will simply get more damage in the early game. Her W's cooldown is being reduced by a second at both first rank and last rank. So that means that a half second is being peeled from the cooldown at each single rank, and the cooldown of her ultimate is being reduced by 20 seconds at all ranks. The W and the passive damage changes are the real big things here that you need to be paying attention to. The ulti cooldown is really nice for when we skirmish during the mid game, especially around the Drake fights, but this isn't the largest buff that Janna is receiving. Now that she has her 550 auto attack range back, I highly recommend that you guys try out W Max Janna. It's really fun to play, miserable to play against, and you're constantly shooting out high damaging pokes. Next up on our buff list is Riven. This is largely due to a Reddit thread that popped up recently. There's a couple of game designers that agree that Riven is in a weird state. The fast Q combo kind of gates a lot of her power, and Riven is not super easy to play for a beginner player. This has made a lot of players shy away from Riven, and Riot wants to bring back a little bit of her player base and make her a little bit more accessible. The way that they're doing this is by increasing her Q's damage and changing the scaling on it overall. We're going from a 45%, 65% AD scaling to a 50 to 70% AD scaling. This is quite significant because Riven does build a lot of bonus AD, and her ultimate also does give her bonus AD. The ultimate bonus AD ratio is also going up by 5%, so these buffs will feed into each other quite nicely. TLDR, if you're a Riven player, you're going to be eating good. If you're somebody that hates Riven, you need to be banning her on patch 13.23. This is a scary champion to buff. Her pick rate used to be really high in the past, but there are simpler champions that do her job more effectively, and she's kind of been phased out of the meta. Overall, these are some nice small buffs, but we'll have to see how Riven does with the new items before anything concrete happens. Next up on the buff list is Trundle. Our first buff is we're receiving 1 more AD growth from 3 to 4, and then our Q mana cost is going down from 30 to 20. These buffs are primarily skewed towards top lane because Riot is overall happy with where Trundle sits in the jungle meta, but they are quite unhappy with how he performs in the top lane. If you've played Trundle top before, you would know why. He burns through mana like no other, his lane is kind of weak until he hits level 6, his split pushing is really good after 3 items, but it takes a long time to get there. There's a lot of flaws in this champion. Giving him some buffs skewed towards top lane is quite nice. Trundle is unfortunately another victim of power creep, far more severely than Riven was. While these buffs will definitely help Trundle top, I don't think that it's going to make this an S tier pick out of nowhere. He's still going to be on the weaker end of top laners because his kit is so dated. Stat checking has largely gone away, there are champions that are better at doing it like Alawi, and the autofocus top lane playstyle has long been dead. Vel'Koz is the next champion on the buff list, and wow, Vel'Koz mains are really upset at Riot for not doing anything to help this champ. A lot of Vel'Koz mains have actually stopped playing the champion completely and they're boycotting him until he gets buffs, and these are the buffs resulting from that boycott. We have a small buff to the passive's base damage and then a 10% buff to the AP ratio, which is going to be quite significant. Will these buffs solve Vel's problems? No, but it's a good start. Interested to see if the Vel'Koz players will still boycott the champion. Now that we covered all the buffs, let's go ahead and move on to nerfs. Our first champion on the nerf list is going to be Briar. Holy, this champion has been nerfed 5 times. Hopefully these nerfs will be significant. Her base health is being reduced by 20. This is not really that big of a deal. And the W missing HP damage is being reduced by 8%, and the bonus AD ratio is also going down by 1%. Remember that Briar's damage is how she heals. The lower her damage is, the lower her healing is overall. Will these be enough to fix her? I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I think that this champion has a kit issue more than anything else. By design, Briar has to win fights or be completely useless, so this will be interesting to see pan out. Currently, at the time of recording this video on patch 13.22, Briar is the second highest winner AD jungler in the game, and she has been for a long time. Her ban rate is really high, but the pick rate is quite low. The people that are playing Briar aren't really Briar mains, it's people that are playing her as a Flavor of the Month champion. Hopefully we can get some changes that make her a little bit less Flavor of the Month and get her ban less so the actual Briar mains can play her. K'Sante is the next champion that is receiving a nerf, and oh my goodness, this is a fat one. K'Sante's Q currently on live has a mana cost of 15 at all ranks. It is going up to 28 and then all the way to 20. This is a very significant nerf to K'Sante, because the mana cost being so low is what allows him to actually create pressure in the lane and to use his passive plus grasp auto so frequently. These are heavy early game nerfs that are definitely going to impact him alone, but they're also changing the base damage on his Q again. K'Sante's Q on the rework had a heavily nerfed base damage, and they're taking it a step further, reducing it from 30 to 150 to 30 to 130. This is a huge deal. Now K'Sante won't run you over at level 9 as hard, and maybe it'll take an extra Q here or there to actually secure a kill onto you. K'Sante's E is also receiving a power shift. Essentially what's happening is the early game value of it is going up, but the late game scaling is going down significantly, especially if we're stacking a lot of HP. The bonus HP ratio is being nerfed from 15% down to 10%, and the flat shielding is going from 45 to 125 to 50 to 210. This is a buff to make K'Sante a little bit tankier in the early game. If you've ever played K'Sante, I'm sure that you understand how mana intensive it is to use his E. This is not a spell that you get often. Now we'll be able to block damage more effectively and kind of tank through our nerfed early game without being completely useless. Next up are some nerfs to K'Sante's R passive amp. These are massive. We're going from a passive amp ratio that scales at level 6, 11, and 16 to one that scales by level. The old passive amp damage is 45%, the new one is going down all the way to 30%, which is what it was before the buffs. They're essentially reverting this completely. The R bonus AD that we get is also being nerfed by an additional 5 at all ranks, with the scaling being unchanged. All of these nerfs combined are really going to hurt K'Sante, and we don't have to worry about him being pick banned as much. If you're a K'Sante main, you'll actually be able to play your champion a little bit more often, and if you hate K'Sante, you won't have to ban him as often. Overall, I think that these changes are in an interesting direction. They're nerfing K'Sante's damage instead of his utility. Currently in All Out, he can permaslow you for 80% over and over and over again, and that might be a little bit more toxic to deal with than his high damage. Most of K'Sante's damage in All Out does come from the W, so hitting the passive and the Q damage is an interesting way to nerf him. Next up on the nerf list is Naafiri. Naafiri is incredibly strong on patch 13.22, and she has been for the past 2 patches. If you watch the tier list, you would know this. This champion is free LP currently, and the nerfs that she is getting really do show this. The damage that our hounds do passively is being nerfed by a quite significant amount. Currently on live, our passive damage is 6 to 29.8, and then after the nerfs is going down to 5 to 25. Remember that we have a whole bunch of pack mates, especially in the ultra late game, so this will be a pretty significant nerf to our damage overall. The E2 damage is also being reduced from 65 to 205 to 60 to 180. This is a fat nerf to Nefari's scaling. Nefari is one of the hardest scaling AD assassins in the game, and this will definitely bring her down a couple of levels. She'll still be really strong for sure, but she won't be absolutely putting people in the blender with a 4-second cooldown E anymore. J4 is receiving another nerf, largely due to Spear of Shojin. Riot themselves has said that Shojin J4 is way too consistent with how often he's able to EQ, and it's very frustrating to deal with. In order to combat Shojin J4, they're increasing his Q cooldown by 2 seconds at max rank. It's going from 10 to 6 to 10 to 8. These are not very substantial nerfs, to be quite honest. J4 usually only gets 1 Q during a gank anyways. The only things that this will affect are when you're running away from him at low HP. Maybe he won't be able to snipe you with a Q as often. Shojin J4 is still going to be equally annoying, and his damage is going to be really high. Ziggs is the next champion on our nerf list, and they are taking the nerf bat directly to his kneecaps. His Q damage is being reduced by 10 at all ranks. This is pretty significant because Ziggs is a poke champion. This will add up very quickly. Remember, our bouncing bomb is on like a 3-second cooldown in the late game, so that 10 extra damage will definitely come to bite us in the butt. The W's cooldown for Ziggs is also going up by 4 seconds at rank 1. It will scale down to 12 seconds like it currently is, but because this is the ability that Ziggs maxes last, he's going to be a lot more susceptible to getting dove. The mana cost on the W is also being increased by 15, going from 65 to 80. The point of this is to prevent Ziggs from using this to freely proc his runes during the lane phase. Ziggs currently can throw his W at you, hit you with the W, and then proc his Mana Flow Band and his Scorch all at once, and there's basically no counterplay to it. This alleviates the resourceless part of that issue. And with that, we conclude our patch 13.23 preview. Once again, this was Unsung with GameLeap. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. I'll see you all in the next video.